I want to tell you something about the desert before I tell you anything else. Most people who have not lived near it think of the desert as empty, as nothing, as the space between places that matter. I have heard people say that people from the coasts, people from cities, people who look out a car window at 100 miles of creosote and rock and see absence. I have spent 20 years riding through that absence. And I want to tell you that they are wrong about what it is. The desert is not empty. The desert is full of everything that has nowhere else to go. Full of heat that has been accumulating since before any of us were born. Full of silence that has a weight to it. A pressure, the kind of silence that pushes back when you try to fill it with noise. Full of things that have been buried. Things that have been forgotten, things that have been waiting with the patience of geology for someone to come along and understand what they are looking at. I know this because of what happened to me on a Tuesday in late August on a stretch of state highway 40 miles east of nowhere. My name on the chapter roster is Michael Briggs. My road name is Gage. I have been riding with the Nevada chapter of the Hells Angels for 20 years. Which means I have been riding long enough to know the difference between a road that wants to kill you and a road that is merely indifferent to your survival. This one was indifferent. High desert, 2 lanes, the blacktop going that particular shade of gray. That means it has been cooking since before sunrise and has not cooled since last October. The kind of road where the heat comes off the asphalt in columns that look like water until you are close enough to know better. The kind of road where a man can ride for 2 hours and not see another vehicle, and not feel the absence of company because the road itself is company enough. I was 51 years old that morning. I had been riding since I was 19. I had put more miles on more roads than most men put on their cars in a lifetime of commuting, and not one of those miles had prepared me for what happened when my front tire found the tar. It was a patch the size of my hand. That is all it was. A section of blacktop repair that had softened in the August heat until it was no longer road, but something closer to adhesive. And when my front tire hit it at 62 miles per hour, the tire did not roll across it. The tire stuck to it for a fraction of a second, and that fraction of a second was enough. The bike went sideways. The world went sideways with it. I had time to know what was happening and no time to stop it, which is the specific cruelty of a low-side fall. And then I was rolling across the gravel shoulder in a cloud of grit and the smell of hot rubber and my own blood. I came up on my feet by instinct. 20 years of riding builds reflexes that the brain does not have to approve first. I was standing before I had consciously decided to stand, bleeding from the elbow, where the road had found the gap between my glove and my sleeve, tasting copper, from a split lip that had met the inside of my helmet during the roll. My bike was on its side 20 feet behind me, with steam coming off the engine in a column that rose straight up in the windless air. Because there was no wind out there. There was never any wind out there, just heat and the sound of insects and the slow clicking of a cooling machine. I stood there for what felt like a long time. It was probably 30 seconds. Then I pulled out my phone. I already knew what I would find. I had ridden this stretch before years ago, and I remembered what the old-timers in the chapter had told me about it. They called it the dead zone, and they did not mean cell service, though that too. They meant the whole stretch of it, 40 miles of high desert highway that had a way of making a man feel like he was the last living thing on earth. No bars, not one. The screen showed me the time, 8:47 in the morning, and nothing else useful. I looked at my bike. The front wheel was bent. The handlebars had taken the fall on the left side, and the left grip was ground down to the metal. The mirror was gone. The engine was not running, and I did not need to examine it further to know it was not going to start again on its own. I was 40 miles from the nearest town I could name on a road that might see 3 cars in a day in August in Nevada, with a busted lip and a phone that was good for telling time and nothing else. I had been in worse situations. That is the thing about 20 years on the road. You build up a catalog of worse situations against which the present one can be measured, and the catalog keeps the present manageable. I was standing up. My bones were intact. The bike was down, but not destroyed. The sun was still climbing, and the serious heat was still 2 hours away. I was going to be all right. I just needed cover, and I needed to wait, and eventually someone would come down this road. They always did. The desert empties out, but it never empties completely. That is when I saw the house. It sat back from the highway maybe 60 yards, set into a shallow rise in the land, where a dry wash ran along the base of it. The kind of topographical feature that would have made the place seem private once protected a place you could sit on a porch and see anyone coming from half a mile away. The brush had grown up around it over decades, and much of it had died and dried, and was now just gray skeleton brush, the color of old bone. The house itself was gray too, boards weathered to the same shade as the desert floor it sat on, as though the years had been slowly working to make it invisible to return it to the landscape it had been carved out of. The roof sagged in the center. The windows were boarded. There were 3 boards across the front window, and one of them had worked loose at the bottom and hung at an angle, giving the house the look of a face with a damaged eye. The porch steps were intact from what I could see. The porch itself looked solid enough. There was a truck at the side of the house sitting on its rims red paint, sun-bleached down to the primer, a Ford, from before anyone built trucks the way they build them now. Maybe a 68, maybe earlier. The tires had been flat so long they had fused with the ground beneath them and become part of the landscape. I had a choice. I could stay at the road and wait for a passing vehicle, which would happen eventually, and might happen in an hour, or might happen at dark. Or I could walk to that house and get out of the sun and wait in the shade of something with walls and a roof. I started walking. The gate at the broken fence was standing open, the hinge so rusted that it could no longer swing in either direction, frozen in a 45-degree angle that said both welcome and warning at the same time. The yard was packed dirt and dead weeds, and the kind of silence that is different from road silence. Road silence has distance in it. The silence in that yard was close. It was the silence of a space that had been inhabited once and had not forgotten. The mailbox at the gate post was bent over at the base as though something had hit it once and nobody had ever come back to straighten it. The numbers had long since faded off the side. I did not know whose address this had been, and I could not have looked it up even if I had wanted to. I walked up to the porch steps and tested the first one with my boot before I put my weight on it. It held. The second one held too. The third one gave a little flex in the wood that was not yet breaking but was making a serious inquiry into the idea. I stepped over it and stood on the porch boards, which were more solid than they looked. Old wood, dense. The kind of lumber they do not cut anymore from trees that took 100 years to grow. There was a screen door hanging on one hinge. The screen itself long since gone, just the frame with a few strands of rusted mesh at the edges. I set it aside and tried the handle of the inner door. Locked. I stepped back. And that is when I saw it. It was nailed to the door frame on the right side. I had not seen it from the yard, because the overhang of the porch roof threw that side of the frame into shadow, and because I had not been looking for it. and because you do not generally look for what you do not expect to find. But now I was close enough, and the angle of the morning light had shifted enough, and I could see it clearly. It was a piece of leather, maybe 4 inches across, faded from whatever color it had been originally down to a gray that was almost the color of the doorframe it was nailed to, cracked at the edges from decades of desert sun that takes the oil out of leather, the way it takes the color out of everything else. The nail that held it was black with rust and had gone deep into the wood, and the wood had grown slightly around it, the way wood does around a foreign object over enough years. I reached up and touched it. Even faded, even cracked, even reduced by time to almost nothing, the shape was unmistakable. A skull, wings, the death's head. I have worn that image on my back for 20 years. I know every curve of it. I know it the way a man knows his own face, by repetition and by feel. And I was standing on a porch in the middle of the Nevada desert, touching a version of that same image on a piece of leather so old that the thread holding it together had rotted away to almost nothing. The shape remained only because the leather itself remembered what it had been, because even abandoned things retain the ghost of their original form. I stood there for a long time with my hand on that patch. This had not been put here recently. The leather was not from this decade, or the one before it. This had been here for 30 years, at a minimum, possibly 50. The nail had been driven with intention. This had not fallen off a vest and been fixed to the nearest surface for safekeeping. This had been placed deliberately. Someone had stood on this porch and nailed the colors of my brotherhood to this doorframe on purpose. In the Hells Angels, you do not leave your patch somewhere unattended. You do not loan it. You do not misplace it. The patch is not a decoration, and it is not a souvenir. It is an identity and a commitment and a declaration, and the men who wear it treat it accordingly. You carry it until you cannot carry it anymore. And if you cannot carry it anymore, there are specific ways that situation gets resolved, and none of them involve nailing the patch to the doorframe of an abandoned house in the desert, unless you had no choice, unless you had left knowing you might not come back and you nailed it there so that if anyone ever came looking, they would know. They would know that one of their own had been here. They would know that this place mattered, or unless you had left so fast and so finally that you could not take it with you, and the best you could do was leave it behind as a marker, as a message, as a thing that said, I was here. I was still one of you when I left. Whatever you heard about me, I was still one of you. I tried the door again. Still locked. I walked around the left side of the house to where the loose board on the front window hung at its angle. I took the board in both hands and pulled. It came loose with a sound like something that had been holding on for a long time, finally letting go. I cleared the broken glass at the bottom edge of the frame with my gloved hand and climbed through into the kitchen. The smell hit me first, not rot. Not death. Something older and drier than either of those. The smell of a sealed place. A place that had been closed against the outside world for long enough, that the inside had become its own climate, its own preserved atmosphere. Dry as old paper. Dry as the desert itself at its most complete. Dust everywhere. The undisturbed kind. The kind that has been settling for so long that it has become a new surface, a soft gray layer over everything that told you by its evenness that nothing had moved in this room in a very long time. My boots left clean prints in it as I walked pressing through to the linoleum underneath. and those prints looked like the first marks made on new ground. A coffee mug sat on the counter to my right. Just a ceramic mug, white once, now the color of old teeth. Whatever had been in it had dried to a dark ring at the bottom, a residue of something that had once been hot, and then had been cold, and then had been nothing for decades. It sat there the way objects sit when the person who last touched them has not come back to touch them again. A refrigerator with the door ajar an inch, empty inside. The smell of old appliance and nothing else. A wall calendar still tacked to the nail beside it, the month showing August, the year showing 1972. I stood still for a moment and did the arithmetic. This was 50 years ago. The person who had last torn a page off that calendar had done it 50 years ago and had not come back to tear another one. 50 years of Augusts had come and gone since then, and this kitchen had held its single August in place the whole time, like a photograph of a moment that refused to become the past. I moved through the kitchen into the front room. The room was dim from the boarded windows, but not dark. Light came through the gap I had made and through the cracks between boards and through the missing sections of the damaged roof board at one corner of the ceiling, and my eyes adjusted quickly, the way they do in spaces that are more shadow than dark. A couch with a sheet over it, a coffee table, an ashtray on the table with a cigarette stub in it that was older than most of the men in my chapter, a television in the corner, black and white, the kind with a dial on the front, the kind where you had to get up and walk to the set to change the channel. And there were only 3 channels worth changing to. A single armchair pulled up to face it. But none of that is what stopped me. What stopped me was the shape under the canvas tarp in the middle of the room. I had ridden motorcycles since I was 19 years old. I had been around iron my whole adult life. I did not need to see what was under the tarp to know what it was. The proportions were right. The height was right. The specific way a covered motorcycle holds its shape even under canvas. The particular relationship between tank and fender and wheel was unmistakable to anyone who had spent enough time around that shape. But I pulled the tarp back anyway. The dust came off it in a cloud that hung in the shaft of light from the window gap for a long moment before it settled. I stepped back from it, and when the dust cleared, I was looking at something I have not been able to look away from since. A Harley-Davidson knucklehead. 1948 by the look of it, by the shape of the engine cases and the configuration of the rocker boxes and the specific curve of the frame that distinguishes a 1948 from anything that came before or after. The engine that bridges 2 eras, half the old design and half what would come next. The transitional machine that mechanics who love old iron can identify by feel in the dark. The chrome was clean. I want you to understand what that means. This bike had been parked in this room in 1972 or thereabouts, and had not been moved since. 50 years of desert temperature fluctuations of summer heat and winter cold, of the slow humidity that even the desert produces at certain hours of the night. And the chrome was clean, not polished, not new, but clean, maintained, protected. Someone had oiled this machine before they left it. Someone had treated the metal and the leather and the paint before they walked out of this room for the last time, as though they had intended to come back and wanted to find it ready when they did. The paint on the tank was a deep burgundy that had not faded. Hand-applied, the brushwork visible if you looked close, the kind of paint job that was done in the era before masking tape and spray guns were the standard done by a man with a brush and a steady hand, and the patience to do it right. And along the side of the tank in a script that nobody uses anymore, the kind of lettering you see on old bar signs and barbershop windows from before a certain decade, was a single name, Voss. I said it out loud. I do not know why. There was no one to hear it. It just needed to be spoken, needed to be confirmed as real by the act of being said in a human voice. Voss. The word came back from the bare walls of the room and the covered couch and the dead television and the ashtray with its 50-year-old cigarette stub. I knew that name. Every man in the Nevada chapter knew that name. Every man who had ever sat in a clubhouse at closing time and listened to the old-timers talk about the old days knew that name. They knew it the way you know the name of a cautionary tale, the way you know the name of the thing that was used to illustrate a lesson about what happens when a man breaks his oath. Cinder Voss. That was what the old men called him, using the road name and the given name together. The way you name a thing you want to make sure cannot be confused with anything else. Cinder. One of the originals of the Frisco chapter, not a founding member, but close enough that the distinction barely mattered. A man who had been there in the formative years, who had helped build what the brotherhood became, who had been trusted with the kind of trust that men in that life extend to maybe 3 or 4 people in a lifetime. And then, in the summer of 1972, Cinder Voss had disappeared, and the story that had followed him through the decades, the story that had settled into chapter history as fact, was this: he had talked to the feds. He had given names. He had sold his brothers to save himself. And then he had run before the chapter could find him and deal with the matter in the way that such matters were dealt with. For 50 years, that had been the story. For 50 years, every man who heard the name Cinder Voss heard it as an object lesson, as a warning, as the shape that betrayal takes when it wears a familiar face. And now I was standing in the man's living room, and the cut was still on the wall. I looked at it. A wooden plaque, unfinished pine nailed flat to the wall behind where the bike stood, and hanging from a small brass hook was a leather vest. Not a jacket, not a coat, a cut. The kind you cannot buy and cannot fake and cannot replicate. The kind that represents the specific and irrevocable fact of belonging to something. I lifted it down with both hands. The leather was supple in a way that 50-year-old leather has no business being. Someone had oiled this, too. Someone had cared for this vest the same way they had cared for the bike, with the specific tenderness of a person maintaining something they intended to return to. I turned it around. The death's head was there, the wings, the number on the bottom tab, and the rocker bars. Top rocker, Hell's Angels. Bottom rocker, Frisco. Original chapter. The one that had started everything. I sat down hard on the floor. My legs did not buckle from injury. My legs let go because some realizations have a physical weight that the body registers before the mind has finished processing them. I sat on the dusty linoleum with Cinder Voss's cut in my lap and the burgundy knucklehead in front of me and the name on the gas tank ringing in my head like a struck bell. If a man turns, if a man breaks his oath and sells his brothers and runs before the accounting comes, the chapter does not let his cut disappear into the desert. The chapter finds it. The chapter takes it back by whatever means necessary. That is not a formality. That is not a policy. That is a foundational principle of what the brotherhood is and what it costs to belong to it. The chapter would have come for this cut, and they did not come for this cut, which meant they did not know where it was, which meant the man who had left it here had left it in a place nobody knew to look. I lit a cigarette. My hand was not entirely steady. I smoked half of it and stared at the bike and let myself sit with the weight of what I was thinking. Outside, the desert was doing what the desert does, accumulating heat against the side of the house the way it accumulates against everything. Patient and absolute. After a while, I became aware of something under my right boot. I became aware of it the way you become aware of sounds that have been present for a while, before your attention found them. There was a quality to the floorboard under my foot that was different from the floorboard beside it. A resonance when I shifted my weight. A hollowness. I set the cut down on the floor beside me. I pressed my palm flat against the boards in a section roughly the size of a welcome mat in front of the couch. I pressed and then I pressed in a slightly different spot. And then I found it. 3 boards cut cleanly from the rest of the floor at some point in the past. By someone who knew what they were doing and had a good saw, and understood that straight cuts hide better than rough ones. The cuts had been concealed under a woven rug that had rotted away to threads and gray fiber barely visible in the dust. The 3 boards came up together when I got my fingers under the edge. They had been fitted with enough precision that they moved as a unit hinged at one end by a few remaining strands of the rug fiber. Underneath was a metal box, painted green. Army surplus, the kind of storage that came home from overseas in duffel bags and found a second life in garages and workshops and apparently in the hidden floors of desert houses. I pulled it out. It was heavier than it looked. Set it on the coffee table next to the old ashtray. The latch was a simple flip-over type, not locked, and it opened without resistance. Inside, on top of everything else, was an envelope. White. Or it had been white once. Now the color of the desert floor outside of the dust on the couch of everything in this house that had once been one thing and had been slowly becoming the landscape for 50 years. Addressed in pencil and handwriting that moved fast across the paper. The kind of handwriting that happens when a person is writing what they need to write before time runs out. The address on the front was the Frisco Clubhouse, the original one, the one that had been the center of everything in those years. The envelope had never been mailed. I set it down. Beneath the envelope was a stack of papers held together with a rubber band that crumbled. The moment I touched it, the rubber gone brittle from decades of dry air, disintegrating into fragments that looked like dried leaves. The papers spread across the table. I picked one up. It was a list. Names, dates, locations, phone numbers. Names I recognized from chapter history. Names of men I had known in their final years, men who had died of cancer, or road accidents, or just the accumulation of years. Some names I did not recognize. Each name had handwritten notes beside it. And next to each name in red ink, a single word. Some said safe. Some said watched. Some said burned. I set the paper down. I looked at the envelope. I looked at the cut beside me on the floor. I looked at the name on the gas tank of the knucklehead. I looked at the list on the table. Then I picked up the envelope, carefully. The paper was fragile the way things get fragile when they have been waiting a long time for handling that never came. I worked the flap open along the dried old glue line slowly without tearing. Inside were 3 pages folded together. The same fast pencil handwriting as the address. Dense. Every line of the page used. I opened the pages. I read the first paragraph. Then I read the second paragraph. Then I stopped. I folded the pages back along their original creases. I set them on the table beside the list and the box. I stood up. I picked up my cigarettes from where they had fallen during the low side, and I walked back through the kitchen. And I climbed back out through the window gap, and I stood on the porch of Cinder Voss's house in the August heat of the Nevada desert. A hawk was sitting on the peak of the roof. I had not seen it before. It was just sitting there the way hawks sit upright and still, and looking at things at a distance that I could not see. It stayed there for a long time without moving. Then it rose without apparent effort and flew east into the sun until it was nothing but a shape. And then, not even that. I lit a cigarette and I stood there on the porch and I thought about what I had just read in those 2 paragraphs. I thought about Cinder Voss. I thought about 50 years of a story that everyone had believed and nobody had verified. Because the man who could have corrected it had been standing on this porch on a summer morning in 1972, with the knowledge that correcting it would get him killed before anyone listened to the correction. I thought about the cut nailed to the doorframe above my head, about what it meant to leave that there, about what it said about the man who had left it, and then I thought about something else, something closer and older and more specifically mine than the story of a man who had disappeared 50 years before I found his house. I thought about Cobb. Dennis Cobb had been in the Nevada chapter for 11 years when they took his patch. That was 6 years ago. I was sergeant at arms at the time, which meant the process of what happened to Cobb ran partly through me, which meant I had standing in what happened, which meant I had options that I did not exercise. The accusation was that Cobb had been skimming from the chapter treasury, not a large amount, a few $100s over several months. The kind of theft that is not about the money, and everyone who understands the culture knows it is not about the money. The money is almost beside the point. What it was about was the oath. What it was about was the specific breach of the specific trust that makes a brotherhood function. The evidence was presented. Cobb denied it. The vote was taken. Cobb lost his patch. I knew the truth. I had not always known it. When the accusation first surfaced, I had no reason to question it. But 2 weeks before the vote, I had seen something. I had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I had seen something that told me clearly without ambiguity, without any possibility of alternative interpretation, that the money had not been taken by Cobb. It had been taken by a man named Garrett Sims, who had been riding with the chapter for 8 years, and who had the kind of standing that made his word worth more than most, and who had, I would later understand, constructed the accusation against Cobb, specifically because he needed someone else to absorb the accounting for what he had done. I had not spoken. I want you to understand why. Because I have spent 6 years trying to understand it myself, and I still do not have an answer that fully satisfies me. I had been sergeant at arms for 2 years, and the position had cost me things to earn. And I was not confident that what I had seen would be believed over what Sims had presented. And I told myself that I needed more evidence, and that I was doing Cobb no favors by speaking prematurely. And by the time I had convinced myself of that, the vote had happened and Cobb was gone. Cobb died 2 years after losing the patch. A single vehicle accident on a state road outside Reno on a Thursday night in November. No other vehicles involved. The investigators said the road was wet, and speed was a factor, and there was nothing more to say about it. I had been to the memorial ride every year since, alone, without telling anyone in the chapter why I was going or where I had been when I came back quiet. I stood on Cinder Voss's porch in the August heat with a cigarette burning down between my fingers, and I thought about what I had just read in those 2 paragraphs. And I thought about how a man who had done what Cinder had done and been believed about it for 50 years was different from a man who had done what I had done and never been suspected of anything at all. Cinder had been punished for a thing he had not done. I had never been punished for a thing I had done. The hawk was gone. The desert was what it had always been, accumulating its patient heat against everything that stood in it. My phone still showed no bars. My bike was still down at the road. I went back inside. I went back to the coffee table and I sat down on the floor in front of it. And I picked up those 3 pages again, and I began to read from the beginning slowly this time, with the full attention of a man who understands that what he is holding in his hands is the most important thing he has encountered in 20 years of writing and possibly in his entire life. The letter was written on 3 pages torn from a standard spiral notebook, the kind you could buy at any drugstore for less than $1 in 1972. The spiral holes were still on the left edge of each page. The paper had yellowed to the color of old maps, but had not brittled, had not crumbled, had been preserved in the dry, sealed air of the metal box, the way certain things are preserved when the conditions are exactly right and nobody disturbs them. The handwriting was pencil-pressed hard enough into the paper that even where the lead had faded, the indentations remained ghost letters you could read by the shadow they cast. I read it once through quickly, the way I had started to before I stopped myself. Then I set it down and sat for a few minutes in the dim room with the covered couch and the dead television and the knucklehead in front of me with the name on the tank. Then I picked it up and read it again from the beginning, slowly this time. The way you read something that requires you to rebuild your entire understanding of a history you thought you already knew. The letter began with a date, June 14th, 1972. Russ Cinder Voss had been 40 years old that summer, which I calculated from what I knew of his history, from the fragments of it that had survived in chapter lore. He wrote in the way a man writes when he is not writing for an audience, when he is writing for the record, for the file, for the version of events that he hopes will outlast the version currently in circulation. Direct. No unnecessary words. The handwriting moved fast, but stayed legible, the hand of a man who had not finished school, but had spent a lifetime making sure nobody knew it. He wrote that on the morning of June 12th, 2 days before the letter. A man had approached him outside the garage where he kept his bike in San Francisco. The man was wearing a suit that cost less than it was trying to cost, and carrying a briefcase that was more prop than tool, the specific combination of elements that Cinder, who had been riding for 22 years by that point, and had developed a comprehensive working knowledge of who wanted what from him and why, recognized immediately. The man said his name was Pryor. He said he was a federal agent. He showed a badge which Cinder examined and said nothing about. Then Pryor said the Bureau had been building a case against the Frisco chapter for 2 years. He said there were wires in 3 different establishments the chapter used regularly. He said there were photographs and recorded phone calls. He said the case was going to land in a matter of weeks, and when it did, every patch holder in the chapter was going to federal prison for a very long time. I stopped reading at this point and looked up at the room around me. I have known men who received this kind of visit over the years. It is not a rare thing in the life I have lived. The response varies depending on the man and the specifics, but there is a range of responses that are recognizable that fall within the expected parameters. What Cinder did in the 48 hours after that conversation was not within those parameters. What Cinder did was something that in all my years of chapter life I'd never heard of anyone doing in exactly that way. Pryor had given him 48 hours to decide whether to cooperate. The cooperation required was 3 names, just 3. The men at the top of the chapter, the ones the Bureau most wanted. In exchange for 3 names, Cinder walked away clean. What Cinder did with those 48 hours was not decide. What he did was investigate. He called in every favor he had accumulated in 22 years of riding. He used money he had saved over a decade of careful living for exactly the kind of emergency that most men in his position assumed would never come. He found a clerk in the federal building downtown who had a need that Cinder's money could address. He found a police officer in the city who had a problem that Cinder's knowledge of certain situations could resolve. He spent 48 hours building a picture of Agent Pryor and the case Pryor claimed to be running. And what that picture showed him by the end of the second day was this. There was no case. There were no wires. There were no photographs. There were no recorded phone calls. There was a single agent who had been suspended 6 months earlier for conduct. The letter did not specify who was running an operation that existed only in his own ambition, using resources and authority he no longer legally possessed, targeting the Frisco chapter because they were visible, and because Pryor needed a high-profile success to get himself reinstated, and because Cinder specifically had a brother in prison whose situation made him a useful point of pressure. Pryor was working alone. The Bureau did not know he was doing this. If Cinder had walked into the federal building and complained about being approached by an agent making threats and demands, Pryor's operation would have collapsed in an afternoon. But Pryor had said something on the second day when he came back for his answer that changed what Cinder could do with what he knew. He said that if Cinder refused to cooperate, his name would be leaked to the chapter as a federal informant, quietly, anonymously, through channels that could not be traced to their source. Cinder would hear his own name spoken as a traitor's name within a week. And within a month, the chapter would have dealt with the matter in the way that such matters were dealt with. I put the letter down again. Outside the window gap, the desert was doing what it does, accumulating its patient heat against the walls of the house. I could hear nothing. No traffic, no wind, just the insects and the silence and the sound of my own breathing. I thought about what that situation required of a man. I thought about the specific nature of that trap. If Cinder went to the Bureau to report Pryor, Pryor would release the leak before anything could be investigated, and Cinder would be dead before the investigation concluded. If Cinder gave Pryor the 3 names, 3 brothers would go to prison, and Cinder would spend the rest of his life knowing what he had done. If Cinder told the chapter about Pryor directly, Pryor would release the leak the same day, and the same outcome followed. There was no path through the situation. That did not cost something enormous. And what Cinder had chosen, I read in the third option he had taken, was to cost himself everything in order to cost the brothers nothing. He ran. He ran with the documentation. Every piece of evidence he had gathered about Pryor's rogue operation. The names of the clerk and the cop, who could corroborate what he knew, the dates and times, and the specific details of both conversations with Pryor. He had planned to take it somewhere safe and wait. Wait for Pryor to be exposed through other means which he calculated was likely given the nature of what Pryor was doing. Wait for the situation to resolve in a way that made it possible to return to present the evidence to stand in front of his brothers and say, "Here is what happened. Here is the truth of what happened. Here is who I am." He had planned to wait a few months, a year at most. He had chosen this house because it was in the dead zone, because nobody came out this way, because it had been owned by a man who owed him a favor, and who had left the country for reasons unrelated to any of this and had told Cinder the place was his to use if he ever needed it. He had driven out in the truck that was now sitting on its rims at the side of the house. He had brought food for a few months, and enough cash to buy more when he needed it. He had brought the knucklehead on a borrowed trailer because he was not leaving the knucklehead behind. He had nailed the patch to the doorframe on the morning he moved in. He wrote that he had done it so that if anyone came looking before he was ready to be found, they would know he was still one of them. He wrote, "I am leaving this here so that if I do not come back, someone will find it and wonder, and maybe the wondering will be enough." I sat with that sentence for a while. Then I picked up the list from the coffee table. I had looked at it before without fully understanding it. I had seen the names and the red ink notations and understood only that they were a record of something without yet having the context to understand what they recorded. Now I read it again. The names were brothers, current members and former members and prospects, and men who had been associated with the chapter in various capacities over the years around 1972. Some I recognized from chapter lore. Most I did not. Next to each name in the compressed, precise handwriting that was already becoming familiar to me, notes, dates, observations. The specific quality of attention that a man gives to something he is tracking over time. Safe, this brother is clean, no federal contact that I can determine, no surveillance I can identify. Watched, this brother is being observed at minimum passive surveillance, origin, unknown, possibly prior or possibly independent. Burned, this brother has been contacted by federal representatives. The contact may be legitimate or may be part of Pryor's operation. Do not use him as a communication channel under any circumstances. I counted the names. 41. 41 men that Russ Cinder Voss had been monitoring, tracking, assessing for risk from the outside, from a house in the desert where nobody knew he was in the months before and after his disappearance. He had not been running from the chapter. He had been watching over them. From a distance of 50 miles in complete social isolation, with no ability to communicate what he was doing or why he had maintained a surveillance of his own brotherhood, to make sure that Pryor's operation, real or fabricated, did not catch anyone unaware. He had been a shepherd who could not be seen by the flock protecting animals who would have killed him on sight if they had found him. And the protection had been real, and it had been sustained. And not one of the 41 names on that list had gone to prison in 1972 or in the years immediately following. That was not coincidence. I set the list down. I picked up the photographs that had been beneath it in the box. Black and white prints, the square format of that era, with the white borders and the date stamp on the back in faded orange ink. I went through them slowly. Men I did not know standing next to bikes I recognized by type and era. Men I did know from the last years of their lives, young and hard-faced in these photos, standing with the specific ease of people who are exactly where they are supposed to be and know it. There was one photograph that I went back to 3 times. It showed Russ Cinder Voss standing in front of the knucklehead. The bike was new in the picture, or close to it. The paint fresh and the chrome unscratched and the leather unmarked by miles. Cinder was maybe 35 years old, lean the way men are lean who have done physical work their whole lives, with a jaw that looked like it had been shaped for the specific purpose of getting hit without breaking. He was not smiling, which was not unusual for photographs from that era and that culture, but his eyes had a quality that was not severity, exactly more like the focused attention of a man who is always measuring distances and angles and outcomes, even when he is standing still. And next to Cinder, with one arm around Cinder's shoulders, was a young man, 22 years old, maybe 23, wearing a prospect vest with no patches on it yet, grinning the way young men grin before life has given them enough material to be more careful about. His arm was around Cinder's shoulders, and Cinder's posture had changed slightly with the arm there had accommodated. It had leaned in almost imperceptibly, the way a man leans in when the contact is welcome. I knew that face. I had known it for 20 years. I had seen it older and harder and bent by a back injury and framed by a full white beard, and topped by the kind of eyes that develop in men who have made very difficult decisions and lived long enough to understand what the decisions cost. I had seen that face across chapter tables and in clubhouse bars and on the back of a bike ahead of me on 100 different roads through 100 different states. Harlan Ironside Mack, chapter president, 76 years old. The man I had ridden under for 20 years, the man whose judgment I had trusted on things that mattered. The man who had told me when I first heard the name Cinder Voss used in a chapter context. The shape of the story as everyone understood it. Cinder Voss turned. Cinder Voss gave up names. Cinder Voss ran before the accounting came. That was the shape of it. Ironside had told it to me with the flat finality of a man reciting a fact that has been verified beyond the need for discussion. Ironside had been a prospect when this photograph was taken. Ironside had been standing with his arm around Cinder Voss's shoulders. Whatever Ironside had told me about Cinder Voss, he had told it from a place of personal loss, so total that the only way to survive it was to replace the person he had lost with a version of that person who deserved to be lost. The man who had once stood with his arm around your shoulders and let you lean on him, and been the first full patch holder who treated you like you already deserved to be there. That man could not be held in the mind alongside the story of what he had supposedly done. So you replaced him. You replaced him with a story, and you told the story so many times and with such conviction that the story became what was real, and the person underneath it became something you no longer had access to. I held that photograph for a long time. I thought about Ironside at 76 with his bad back and his cane and his white beard sitting in the chapter house in Reno, telling road stories to prospects who would have given anything to have a fraction of his history. I thought about the specific way he went quiet sometimes in the middle of a conversation. A pause that was not a search for words, but a visit to somewhere else. The specific quality of absence that comes over a man when he is briefly somewhere other than the room he is in. I thought about him carrying this for 50 years. And then, because the desert does not allow you to think about one thing without thinking about another, I thought about Cobb again. About carrying something for 6 years and thinking I understood what carrying it felt like. 6 years. 50 years. There is no scale that puts those two things on equal ground. But the carrying is the same kind of thing. The weight accumulates differently in different men over different lengths of time, but it accumulates the same way by taking up space that should have been available for something else, by making the person who is carrying it slightly less present in every room they enter than they would have been if they were not carrying it. I put the photograph face down on the coffee table and picked up the last item from the metal box. A small leather notebook. The kind a man carries in his shirt pocket. Dark brown leather with a simple brass clasp that had oxidized to a dull gold color. I opened the clasp carefully. The pages inside were filled from front to back. Every line used the handwriting the same as the letter, but smaller, compressed to fit as much as possible into the available space. It was a journal, not a diary in the conventional sense. There were no entries that read like personal confession. No lengthy descriptions of emotional states or interior experiences. What it was a record. Dates and observations. Weather. Notes on what he could see from the house on the days he climbed to the ridge to the north, where he could see a 2-mile stretch of highway. Notes on what he heard from the radio before the batteries died, which happened in the first year. Notes on what he was thinking about specific brothers on specific dates. whether the situation had changed, whether any new information had found its way to him through the limited channels available to a man living off the grid in the Nevada desert in the early 1970s. I turned pages. The early entries had a quality of structure to them, of intentionality, of a man who had a plan and was executing it. He was eating and sleeping regularly enough to note it. He was maintaining the bike. He was working through the box of books he had brought with him. He was calculating timelines, estimating how long Pryor's operation could continue before someone inside the bureau noticed, assessing the likelihood of the situation resolving in various ways. There was an entry dated roughly 8 months, and that said, "I believe Pryor is losing support from wherever he was getting it. The activity I tracked on 4 brothers has decreased significantly in the last 6 weeks. Either he has moved on or he is running out of resources. If the pattern continues another month, I will consider making contact through a channel I have been developing." The channel was not described. The pattern apparently did not continue in a way that allowed contact. There was no further mention of it. The middle section of the journal changed in quality. The structure became less consistent. There were gaps between entries, weeks, and then months, without a date recorded. And when entries resumed, they were shorter, more stripped down. The handwriting still precise, but covering less ground. He was still maintaining the bike. He was still eating. The world he was describing was getting smaller. I turned pages until I found the entry that had been in the back of my mind since I read the outline of the timeline in the letter. It was dated in 1979. The handwriting was the same, but there was a quality to the pressure of the pencil that was different from the earlier entries, lighter, as though the hand were less certain of its right to leave marks. He wrote, "I have heard from a passing driver who stopped for water, the first person to speak to me in 11 months, that a federal agent named Pryor was arrested in Sacramento last fall on corruption charges unrelated to my situation. The driver had no additional details. I have no way to verify this independently, but if it is true, the primary threat to my return is resolved. The documentation I have should be more than sufficient to demonstrate what Pryor was doing. The question is whether the chapter will hear it. I will need to be careful about how I make contact. There is a brother whose name I will not write here who I believe would receive me fairly. I will reach him through means that do not involve walking directly into a situation before I know the temperature of it." I turned the page. The next entry was also 1979. It said only no response to the first message. The channel I was using may no longer be available. Then 1980. 3 entries spread across the year. 2 of them were about maintaining the bike. One said, "I have begun to consider whether the documentation matters as much as I believed it did. If Pryor is gone, the threat that drove me here is gone. But I am not sure the threat was ever the only thing that needed to be addressed. There are men who are angry at a story they were told. That story does not change because the story was wrong. The anger does not change. I need someone who knew me to remember who I was before they heard the story." I set the notebook down on my knee and sat with that for a moment. Then I picked it up and kept turning. The years went by in pages. The entries got shorter. 1983, 1 entry. He had fixed a section of the roof that had begun to let in rain. He had found the truck's old toolkit in the bed and used it for purposes it was not designed for. 1986, 2 entries. He had seen a coyote in the yard 3 nights running. He had started talking to it because silence at a certain depth becomes something you have to push back against, or it pushes back against you. 1988, 1 entry. 1991 entry. The observations of the highway, which had been detailed in the early years with counts of vehicles and identifications of makes and models, had stopped appearing entirely. He was still writing, but he was writing less about the outside world and more about a small set of things. The bike, which he continued to maintain, with what must have been diminishing supplies of what it needed. Certain memories of specific rides he had taken in the years before all of this, and a recurring theme that was not stated as a theme, but was present in almost every late entry in the way a bass note is present in a piece of music felt more than heard. He was waiting to be found, not rescued, not pardoned, not exonerated by some external authority. He was waiting for one of his brothers to find him. He was waiting for the 41 names on that list to become real people who showed up at this house the way real people show up without announcement on a road nobody else was using. I turned pages until I reached a section near the back where the writing changed again. The entries were very short now. The dates were less consistent. The handwriting was the same precise hand, but the pressure was different. Again, not lighter this time, but different in a way that I could feel more than describe the way you can feel the difference between a sentence written by a man who believes he has more sentences ahead of him and a sentence written by a man who is beginning to calculate how many he has left. And then I turned a page and found an entry that stopped me. It was dated in 1979. But the ink was different from the surrounding entries added later at a different time than when the page had been originally written. A single line squeezed into the margin at the bottom of the page, in handwriting that was smaller than everything else I have confirmed. Pryor was arrested. I have waited 8 months for someone to come. No one has come. I turned pages. And then, near the very back of the notebook, on a page that was stiffer than the surrounding pages, because something had gotten into the binding at some point, and the page had swollen and dried at an angle, there was the last entry. I could not determine the year with certainty. The date was written in pencil that had gone very faint. The month was legible and the day was legible, but the year had faded to a shadow that might have been 1991. Or might have been 1993. What I could read clearly was what he had written because he had pressed harder for this entry than he had pressed for anything in the last 50 pages of the notebook. He wrote, "The bike is in good shape. I oiled it again this morning. If someone finds this place, they should know that it will start. It was always a good engine. I was proud of that engine." He wrote, "I have tried to remember everyone who rode with me. I have written most of them in the earlier pages. If I have missed any of them, I am sorry for the omission." Then he wrote, "I had a plan. The plan required someone to come. I believed that someone would come because I believed in the brotherhood. And I believed that the brotherhood was capable of finding the truth, even after it had been fed a lie. I still believe that. I'm leaving the documentation where it can be found. When it is found, it will speak for me." And then the last line, "I have run out of road. I am going to lie down now." I sat on the floor of his living room with his notebook on my knee, and the desert pressing its heat against the walls on every side, and I did not move for a long time. He had known Pryor was gone as early as 1979. By 1979, the threat that had driven him out had been removed by the ordinary workings of the system he had run from. By 1979, the path back to the chapter was open in the way it had not been. In 1972, the primary obstacle gone, the documentation he had gathered, suddenly more than sufficient to demonstrate what had actually happened. By 1979, he should have been able to come home. He had tried. The entry in the margin made that clear. He had tried through channels he did not describe in the notebook, had waited 8 months for some response that told him his message had arrived. Had gotten nothing. Whether the channel had failed and his message had never reached anyone, or whether his message had reached someone who had not believed it, or had not acted on it, or had made a calculation, that the cost of acting on it was too high. The notebook did not say. What it said was that he had tried and nobody had come, and so he had stayed. He had stayed for another 12 years after that, maintaining the bike and writing in the notebook and waiting for a brother to come down the road and find him. And at the end of those 12 years, he had gone into the back room and lain down on the bed, with his boots on and his hands folded on his chest. And he had died in this house in the Nevada desert, surrounded by the documentation of his innocence, and nobody had come to receive it. I thought about that. I thought about the specific quality of that particular kind of waiting. I had waited for things in my life the way all men wait for things, but I had always had the option of stopping the wait. I could always choose to act, to move, to change the conditions that required me to wait. Cinder had not had that option. He had constructed a situation for reasons that made sense when he constructed it, and may have continued to make sense for years after, in which all he could do was wait. The action he had taken had been to run and hide and document and wait. And once the action was taken, the only thing left was the waiting, and the waiting had become his entire life. And his entire life had been consumed by it. I thought about Cobb. Cobb had not waited. Cobb had done what men do when they lose the thing that defined them. He had ridden harder and faster, and with less caution in the way that men ride when they are not riding towards something, but away from something. And eventually the road had given him the outcome that kind of riding tends to produce. He had not waited. He had not had the capacity for the kind of waiting Cinder had demonstrated, the long, patient endurance of a man who still believed that eventually the truth would find its audience. I wondered sometimes in the 6 years since Cobb died, whether if I had spoken when I should have spoken, whether Cobb would still be riding, whether the quality of his last 2 years of riding would have been different if he had known that one person in the chapter had known the truth and had been sitting on it. Whether knowing you are not entirely alone in the world is enough to change the angle of approach to the particular stretches of wet road that winter nights produce. I did not know. I would never know. What I knew was that I was sitting in a room that had been sealed for decades with 50 years of someone else's silence around me. And the silence had a weight that I recognized because I had been carrying a smaller version of the same weight for 6 years. And the weight of his silence made mine feel exactly as heavy as it was, which was heavier than I had allowed myself to understand before this particular Tuesday in August. I looked at the photograph that I had set face down on the coffee table. I turned it over. Ironside young with his arm around Cinder's shoulders in front of a bike that was new and a future that was still unwritten. I thought about what it would mean to take this back to him, to walk into the chapter house in Reno with this box and this letter and this notebook and this photograph, and sit across from Harlan Ironside Mack and watch the man who had been that young prospect in that photograph understand what he had been wrong about for 50 years. I thought about what it would cost him. I thought about what it would give him. I thought about the grave marker at the chapter cemetery plot, the one I had never visited because it predated my time in Nevada by decades, the one the old-timers sometimes mentioned when they were running through the names of lost brothers in the way that men of a certain age run through names when enough time has passed. I thought about whether it had dates on it, whether someone had known enough about when Cinder had died to put the dates there, or whether it was just the name. I sat there until I could see from the change in the light through the window gap that the sun had moved a significant distance across the sky, 2 hours at least, maybe more. The heat was serious now, the mid-morning desert heat that does not negotiate. I put the photograph back in the box. I put the list back in the box. I put the letter back in its envelope and set it on top of the list. I put the notebook on top of everything. I did not close the box. I sat, looking at it for a while longer. Then I got up. I carried the box to the kitchen and set it on the counter next to the dried coffee cup. I went out through the window gap and walked back down the dirt yard and through the frozen gate and across the shoulder to where my bike was lying. The bike was not going to start. I already knew that. I was 40 miles from a town. The road was empty in both directions. I looked east and I looked west. And then I sat down on the gravel shoulder in the shade thrown by my fallen bike, and I waited because waiting was what the situation required. And I had just finished reading the story of a man who had understood this better than I did. And something in me had shifted in the reading of it. Something that had to do with what waiting costs and what it means, and what it says about a man that he is capable of it. I waited for 4 hours. I smoked 3 cigarettes and counted 17 vehicles that passed without slowing, and then a long-haul trucker in a Peterbilt who saw the fallen bike and the man sitting next to it and pulled over without being asked. Because that is what certain men do when they see that kind of situation. Because some things do not require explanation. The trucker did not ask many questions. He looked at my cut, and he looked at me, and he put the bike situation together without needing the details explained. He took me 40 miles west to a crossroads with a truck stop and a payphone next to a vending machine that sold things I did not want, at prices that suggested it had been stocked before the current decade. I called Ironside from that payphone. I did not tell him much. I said I had found something. I said it concerned the chapter. I said it concerned all of us. I said I needed him to come, and I needed him to bring the chapter. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, "How many?" I said all of them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It is that kind of thing then." I said, "Yes, yes, brother, it is that kind of thing. It is that kind of..." I hung up the payphone. I went inside the truck stop and bought a coffee from a machine that produced something that was technically coffee, and sat at a counter by the window and watched the parking lot fill with the ordinary late afternoon traffic of a road stop in the Nevada desert. Trucks and haulers and the occasional passenger car. People moving between places that were not here. People who did not know. That 40 miles east of them, a house was sitting in the desert with a box on its kitchen counter that was going to change what everyone knew about what it meant to be loyal to something when loyalty was the most expensive thing you owned. It took the chapter 9 hours to gather. 23 men from 3 different states riding in from wherever. Tuesday night had found them converging on a truck stop on a state highway in Nevada. Because Gage had called and said it was that kind of thing. They came in waves. The first man arrived before midnight. The last man arrived just after sunrise. By 7 in the morning, 23 Harleys sat idling in the parking lot of the truck stop in the early light. And Ironside stood beside his bike with his cane and his white beard and his 76 years of accumulated understanding and looked at me and said, "Show me what you found." I pointed east. We rode 2 abreast, 23 Harleys on a state highway in the early morning light. The desert still in that brief window of cool that precedes the heat by an hour and makes the air feel like a different country from the one it will become by noon. I rode at the front beside Ironside. He did not ask questions. He had asked one question at the truck stop when the last man had arrived, and the engines were all running and the column was formed and ready to move. He had looked at me and said, "Is this going to hurt?" I said yes. He nodded once the way a man nods when he asked a question he already knew the answer to and needed to hear confirmed anyway. Then he put his bike in gear and we pulled out onto the highway. I watched him from the corner of my eye as we rode. 76 years old. Back that had been bad since 1994, the year a fall at highway speed had compressed 2 vertebrae in a way that the surgeons had fixed well enough to keep him upright, but not well enough to keep him fully comfortable. He rode with a modification to his setup that took the worst of the weight off the spine, but you could still see it in the set of his shoulders, the slight forward lean that was not aggression or attitude, but accommodation. The management of pain that has been present long enough to become part of the architecture of how a man moves through the world. He had been riding with Cinder Voss before the pain, before the back injury, before the gray in the beard and the cane he used off the bike. He had been 22 years old with a prospect vest and no patches yet, and his arm around the shoulders of the man who had been the first full patch holder to treat him like he already deserved to belong. That was what I was thinking about as we rode east into the early sun. The house came into view at the 40-minute mark. The gray shape of it set back from the highway in the dry brush the same way I'd seen it the day before, when I had been standing next to a fallen bike with blood on my elbow and no signal on my phone. From the road, it looked like what it was, a place that had been left by everyone who had ever been in it and had been waiting since for someone to return. I turned off the highway onto the dirt track that ran from the road to the broken gate. The column followed. 23 motorcycles on a track that had not carried traffic in decades. The tires raising a low cloud of dust that hung in the still air behind us. We stopped at the gate and dismounted one by one, engines cutting in sequence until there was just the desert silence and the sound of boots on packed dirt. Nobody spoke. I had not told them anything on the road. I had not called anyone with details the night before. I had said it was that kind of thing, and Ironside had said the same to the men he called, and they had come because that was what you did when it was that kind of thing. You came and you saw, and you understood when you saw it. That was how it had always worked. Some things cannot be explained in advance and do not need to be. I led them through the gate and up the dirt yard to the porch. I stopped at the foot of the porch steps and I pointed at the doorframe. I did not say anything. I did not need to. 23 men stopped behind me and looked at what was nailed to that doorframe, and the sound that moved through them was not a sound I can describe accurately. It was not surprise, or not only surprise. It was the sound that comes out of a man when something he had locked away in a specific room of his understanding is suddenly and irrevocably unlocked, when a door he had decided to keep closed is opened from the outside by something he did not expect. The older brothers made sounds in their throats. Men who had been in the chapter for 30 or 40 years. Men who had been there when the name Cinder Voss had first been spoken, as a cautionary tale rather than a name of honor. Men who had grown up in the chapter hearing that story, the way they heard all the stories that form the foundation of what a brotherhood is as facts, rather than versions as settled history, rather than one account among possible others. One man, a brother named Harv, who had been riding for 38 years and had the kind of face that does not show much, put his hand flat against the doorframe beside the patch and stood there with his palm against the old wood for a long moment and did not move. I climbed the porch steps. I unlocked the front door from the inside. The same way I had locked it when I left the day before, through the window gap and then out the front. I swung it open. I stepped aside and I let them in. I watched their faces as they passed through the door, and into the dim kitchen, and through to the front room, and I want to try to describe what I saw, but I am not certain I have the language for it. What I saw was 23 men encountering a room that had been preserved against their arrival for 50 years. A room that had waited for exactly this, for exactly the right people to come through it. And the room did what it had been waiting to do, which was to make them understand something they had not understood before. They saw the calendar on the kitchen wall. They saw the dried mug on the counter. They saw the dust and the stillness and the quality of air that belongs to a sealed place. And they understood, before they saw the bike, what kind of place this was and why it mattered. Then they moved into the front room and they saw the bike. The tarp was still off from when I had pulled it the day before. The knucklehead sat in the center of the room with the morning light coming through the window gap in a shaft that fell across the tank, across the name painted there in the old script. And the name was visible to everyone who walked through the door. And they all read it, and they all went quiet with the reading of it. The cut was on the wall where it had always been. 41 years of brotherhood hanging on a pine plaque above the machine that had been maintained as a promise of return. I watched Ironside. He was the last one in. He came through the front door behind the others, and he moved through the kitchen slowly, his cane taking the weight off the bad back. And he came into the front room and he stopped. He stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the front room, and he looked at the bike, and he looked at the name on the tank, and he looked at the cut on the wall, and he looked at the photograph I had placed on the coffee table the night before, when I had come back to secure the house, the photograph of himself at 22, with his arm around the man whose bike was in front of him now. Vardov. He stood there for a long moment. Then he walked past the bike. He walked past the photograph without picking it up. He walked to the single armchair in front of the dead television, and he lowered himself into it with the careful economy of a man whose body requires cooperation rather than command. And he sat back in it, and he placed both hands over his face. He did not weep loudly. He did not weep long. He wept the way old men weep when they have held something for so long that the holding has become structural, has become load-bearing. And when the load is finally shifted, the body responds before the mind has fully caught up with what is happening. He wept for less than a minute. And 22 men who had ridden through the night from 3 different states stood in the dust of that room and did not say a single word, because there was no word that had any business being said in a moment like that one. The armchair he was sitting in was the armchair that Cinder Voss had sat in. I do not know if Ironside knew that. I think he might have. Some things are communicated by a room without being stated. Some rooms have a gravity to them that pulls you toward the place where the weight was concentrated. And I think the weight in that room had been concentrated in that chair for 50 years. And I think Ironside felt it without needing to be told. When he lowered his hands, his eyes were dry. He looked at me. I told him everything. I had the letter and the list and the notebook, and I went through all of it, reading sections aloud and paraphrasing others, and the room stayed quiet around the reading except for the small sounds that men make when they are hearing something that is rearranging the furniture of their understanding. I read them the passage about the 48 hours of investigation. I read them the section about Pryor working alone. I read them the list with its notations of safe and watched and burned. And I told them what that list meant, that Cinder had been monitoring the chapter from the desert for the months around his disappearance, tracking who was at risk, maintaining a surveillance of his brothers from a distance of 50 miles, with no way to communicate what he was doing. I read them the 1979 entry about Pryor's arrest. I told them what I understood that to mean that by 1979, Cinder had known the threat was gone, had tried to reach back through some channel that had failed, and had stayed in the desert for another 12 years waiting for someone to come. Nobody interrupted me while I was reading. The room was the quietest room I have ever been in with that many people in it. When I finished, the silence held for a while. Then a voice from the back of the room, Leroy Buckshot Ware, the chapter vice president, 63 years old, with hands that looked like they had been designed for a larger species, said he came back here to die alone. Nobody answered him because there was no answer to give that would have been worth the breath it cost. Ironside looked around the room slowly. He looked at the men who had ridden through the night. He looked at the bike. He looked at the cut on the wall. Then he said, "We have a brother to bring home." Buckshot went into the back bedroom first. He went alone. He pulled the door closed behind him, and he was in there for 10 minutes. And what happened in those 10 minutes in that room is between Buckshot and the man he found in it, and I will not speculate on it. When he came out, he did not say anything. He looked at Ironside and he nodded once, a single downward movement of a head that communicated everything that needed to be communicated between men who have known each other long enough to speak in that economy. 6 brothers went in together. There was a hall closet with a shelf of linens folded and placed there decades ago by the same hands that had oiled the bike and maintained the chrome and nailed the patch to the doorframe. The linens had yellowed, but they had held their integrity in the dry air. The brothers took a sheet from the shelf, and they went into the back bedroom and they wrapped Russ Cinder Voss in it, and they carried him out. I will not describe what 50 years in a sealed desert room does to a body in the kind of detail that would serve no purpose. I will say that the dry air of the Nevada desert is capable of preservation that surprises people who do not know the desert well, and that the man the brothers carried out of that room was recognizable as a man who had lain down with intention, with his boots still on and his hands arranged on his chest, in the way of someone who understood what he was doing when he did it and wanted to be ready. They carried him out through the front door and across the porch and down the steps and across the dirt yard and through the gate, and they placed him in the bed of the truck that a brother from the Las Vegas chapter had driven out ahead of the column. The bed lined with the same canvas tarp that had covered the knucklehead for all those years. We formed up. 23 Harleys behind a pickup truck, 2 abreast on the highway heading west. People pulled over for us. This is something that happens on American roads when a procession like that one passes, and it happens for reasons that the people pulling over could not always fully articulate if you ask them. They see something moving with that kind of order and intention and weight, and something in them responds to it before they have consciously decided to respond. They pull over. They stop. They watch. We rode through 3 towns and nobody honked. A school bus pulled to the shoulder outside the second town, and the kids inside pressed their faces against the windows in the flat-palmed way of children looking at something they cannot categorize. A man standing at a gas pump put his hand on his chest without appearing to decide to do it, a gesture from somewhere older than the reasoning mind. We rode him home. The burial plot at the chapter cemetery was in a section that had been set aside in the early years, when the chapter had understood with the pragmatic clarity of people who live close to the realities of mortality that there would eventually be brothers who needed somewhere to go. The plots there told the history of the chapter in the way that only accumulated names and dates can tell not as a story, but as a list. The list of who had been there, and what years they had occupied, and what remained. The headstone for Russ Cinder Voss was in the third row. I had not seen it before. It predated my membership by decades. It was granite simple, the kind of stone that was chosen for durability rather than display. And when I walked up to it on the morning of the burial and looked at what was carved into it, I stood there for a moment before I could move forward. The stone said, Russ Cinder Voss. That was all. No dates, no epitaph, just the name. I looked at it for a long time. Then I looked at Ironside, who was standing a few feet away with his cane and his white beard and his 76 years. I asked him why there were no dates. He looked at the stone. He was quiet for a moment. And in the quiet I could hear the specific quality of a man locating words that have been waiting a long time to be used. Then he said, because I could not write the date of death for a man I was not certain had earned it. He said it quietly, and he said it to the stone rather than to me, the way certain things need to be said to their subject, rather than to a witness. He said in 1972, I believed what I was told. I believed it because it was easier to believe it than to carry the alternative, which was that a brother I loved had been taken from me by something I could have prevented if I had known what was happening. I believed he was a traitor because the other possibility was that I had failed him. And I could live with a traitor. I could not live with having failed him. He stopped. Then he said, but I could not put the year of death on that stone. I told everyone it was because we did not know the year. That was true. We did not know. But the reason I did not look harder for the year, the reason I never pushed for a more complete answer, was that I could not write the final date for a man I was not entirely certain had earned the story I had told about him, even after 50 years of telling it. I stood beside him and I looked at the stone with no dates on it, and I thought about what it means to carry doubt for 50 years, not certainty in either direction. Not the clean grief of a man who knows he was wrong and has accepted it. The specific weight of sustained uncertainty of a story you are not fully certain is true, but have told so many times it has become the only available version. The weight of a man who kept a burial plot open for a brother he believed was a traitor because he could not entirely close the question. That was not nothing. That doubt maintained for 50 years against the pressure of a story that had become accepted fact was not nothing. It was the thing that had kept the plot open and the stone incomplete. It was the thing that had made it possible for the truth to have somewhere to land when it finally arrived. The funeral was attended by every patch holder from 3 chapters, by a family of original founders who had not stood together in a generation, by men who had heard the name Cinder Voss spoken their whole lives as a warning, and were now hearing it spoken differently for the first time. There was no preacher. The road captain stood at the head of the grave and said the words, and the words he chose were few, because the situation did not require many. He said, Russ Cinder Voss rode out alone in the summer of 1972 to protect the rest of us. He gathered evidence that would have cleared his name and protected his brothers. He waited for someone to come for 19 years. Today, 50 years after he rode out, he comes back. That was the whole of it. That was enough. After the burial, the chapter rode back to the clubhouse in Reno, and they stayed through the night and into the next day. They did not celebrate. They did not observe the occasion the way they observed some occasions with the particular rituals of release that men in that life have developed for moments of triumph or survival. What they did instead was tell stories. The older brothers told stories about Cinder that they had been quietly ashamed of for decades. Stories of rides and moments, and the specific quality of a man they had loved, and then been told to hate, and had spent 50 years trying to forget. They could tell the stories now. They told them without shame. They told them out loud in the light with other men listening who were hearing certain names and places and events for the first time. Filling in a section of the map that had been left blank for half a century, the knucklehead came back to the clubhouse on a flatbed the morning after the burial. Ironside would not allow anyone to touch it beyond what was required to secure it for transport. He would not allow it to be cleaned. He stood in the clubhouse parking lot while it was unloaded, and he watched it come off the flatbed, and he said, "The dust on that bike is 50 years of what we owe him. We are not wiping it away." The bike went into the corner of the main room in the spot that was cleared for it without discussion. The spot that felt right in the way that certain spots in rooms feel right for certain things. It sat there with 50 years of Nevada desert on every surface chrome, and paint and leather, all softened by the same gray layer. And it was the most significant object in that room, and everyone who walked in understood that, without being told. The cut went up on the wall behind the bar. The Death's Head and the wings and the chapter designation, Hell's Angels Frisco, the original chapter that had started everything. And below the cut, mounted on the wall, a small brass plaque. The kind of brass that will outlast everyone currently living. The plaque said, "Russ Cinder Voss, brother, lost and found." There was a chapter meeting 10 days later at which several items of business were addressed, and at the end of which, after the main business was concluded, and the room was about to move into the informal part of the evening, Ironside stood up. He said, "We have a position that needs filling." He said, "Gage." I looked at him. He held out the new patch. He said, "You found him, which means you carry the weight of finding him for the rest of the time you ride. You carry the story, and you tell it to every new prospect, and every new patch, and every visitor who asks about the bike in the corner. You tell it until you cannot ride anymore, and then you tell it after that." He said, "Sergeant at Arms." I took the patch from his hands. The room was quiet around the taking of it. That night after the meeting, after most of the brothers had gone, and the clubhouse had settled into the later hours, I was getting ready to leave when I heard a knock on the frame of the side door. Ironside was standing in the doorway with his cane and his jacket on and his keys in his hand. He said, "Get in the truck." He did not say where we were going. I did not ask. I have known Harlan Ironside Mack for 20 years, and there are times when asking a question is a way of indicating that you do not yet understand the nature of a moment, and this was not one of those times. I got in the truck. We drove for 40 minutes. The city gave way to the outskirts, and the outskirts gave way to the particular Nevada landscape that exists at the edge of organized human settlement. The scrub and the low hills and the roads that are maintained but not heavily traveled. I watched out the passenger window and I let the miles go by without counting them. We turned off the main road onto a narrower one, and then off that one onto a gravel track, and the headlights found the gates of the chapter cemetery. Ironside parked outside the gates. We got out. He did not use the cane on the uneven ground the way he sometimes did not use it when the ground required him to be more careful about his balance, as though the cane was an aid for flat surfaces. But on uneven ground, he trusted his own legs more. We walked through the gates. He turned left toward the 3rd row. I turned right. Dennis Cobb was in the 7th row, 4th stone from the path. I had been here twice before, both times alone. Both times in the specific hours of the morning before anyone else was moving. And I had stood at this stone both times without speaking because I did not know what I had the right to say to a man who was owed words I had not spoken, when the speaking of them would have changed something. I stood at the stone now. The night was clear, the way Nevada nights are clear. the sky carrying more stars than most places in the country allow the temperature having dropped from the day's heat to something that required a jacket. I stood with my jacket on and my hands in my pockets, and I looked at the stone with Cobb's name on it, and his dates, and the road name that the chapter had allowed to be placed there. Because road names are the names that mean something to the people who knew them. I thought about what I had read in Cinder's notebook over the last 2 weeks, about the specific nature of the waiting he had done about the 19 years between his attempt to make contact in 1979 and the final entry in the notebook about what it means to maintain hope for that long in conditions that provide no reasonable basis for it. I thought about what I had been doing for 6 years, and I was honest with myself about it, in a way that I had not managed to be fully honest before. I'd been managing the knowledge of what I had done in a way that kept it contained enough to function with. I'd been going to the memorial rides and sitting with the weight of it, and riding home and putting it away again in the specific interior compartment where I kept things I was not prepared to fully address. I had been living with it the way Cinder had been living in that house, not free of it, but not fully present in the same room with it either. I said Cobb's name out loud, not to announce myself, not as a greeting. As an acknowledgement, the same way Cinder had said the name on the gas tank out loud in the empty room, because certain things need to be confirmed as real by a human voice. Then I told him what I had not told anyone. The full account of it without the management, without the version of it that kept the weight bearable. I told him what I had seen, and what I had known, and what I had calculated, and what I had chosen in the calculation. I told him about Garrett Sims and the evidence and the timing of the vote, and all the specific details that I had been carrying for 6 years in the way that things are carried when there is nowhere to put them down. I wasn't doing it for absolution. I want to be clear about that. I was not standing at a grave at midnight asking for forgiveness from a man who could not grant or withhold it. That was not the point of it, and I knew it was not the point. The point was that the knowledge needed to exist somewhere outside of me. It had lived inside me for 6 years as a secret, which meant it had lived as a weight rather than a fact. And facts are lighter than secrets, because secrets require maintenance and facts do not. I was putting the weight down. I did not feel clean when I finished talking. I did not feel anything that could be described as relief in the comfortable sense of the word. What I felt was something closer to what Cinder had described in his 1972 letter when he was explaining why he had chosen to run rather than stay and fight. I have taken the only action available to me. The outcome of that action is not in my hands. What is in my hands is the decision to take it. The decision to say it had been in my hands for 6 years. I had taken it. Across the cemetery in the 3rd row, I could see the shape of Ironside standing at Cinder's stone. He was not moving. He was simply standing there in the clear Nevada night with the stars overhead and 50 years of wrong belief behind him and 3 weeks of corrected knowledge in front of him. And he was standing at the grave of the man he had failed to defend. The same way I was standing at the grave of the man I had failed to defend, and neither of us was talking, and neither of us was leaving. We stood at our respective graves for a long time. The night moved around us the way desert nights move, with the long, slow quality of time, in a place where the pace of things is set by geology rather than human urgency. I do not know how long we stood there. Long enough for the temperature to drop another few degrees. Long enough for the stars to shift their positions by a measurable distance. When I finally moved and walked back through the graves toward the gate, I saw Ironside walking back from the 3rd row at the same time. We met at the center path and walked out through the gate together without speaking. We got into the truck. Ironside started the engine and pulled out onto the gravel track. We drove back to the city in the same silence we had driven out in. Not the silence of men who have nothing to say. The other kind. The kind that exists between men who have been to the same place by different routes and have come back changed in ways that do not require immediate discussion, that will express themselves over the course of the years ahead in small differences of behavior and judgment, and the specific quality of attention that a man brings to the things that matter to him. Two men, two graves, two kinds of debt that could not be paid and could only be acknowledged, familiar but not resolved, present but no longer secret. I became sergeant at arms the following week in the formal ceremony with the whole chapter, standing the same way it had always been done. Ironside handed me the patch and said what he had said at the informal meeting, that I carried the weight of finding Cinder, and that the weight expressed itself by being the keeper of the story. The man who told it to new prospects and new patches and visitors who came through the clubhouse and saw the bike in the corner covered in its 50 years of desert dust. I have told that story many times now. I have told it slowly, and I have told it completely. And I have never told it exactly the same way twice, because the same story does not ask the same things of you twice. Sometimes the prospect I am telling it to is 23 years old and has not yet lived enough to understand what 50 years of waiting means. And I tell it in a way that plants the seed of understanding rather than trying to force the flower. Sometimes the man I am telling it to is older a man who has made his own calculations in his own situations and is sitting with his own version of what I sat with in a desert house on a Tuesday in August. And I tell it differently then, more directly, with less narrative scaffolding and more of the plain weight of it. But I always end the same way. I say, my front tire caught a patch of melted tar the size of a man's hand. That was the only reason I found him. If I had been going 1 mile an hour faster, I would have ridden through that spot before the tar could catch the tire, and I would have made it to Reno by mid-morning, and I would never have turned off onto the dirt track, and I would never have climbed through that window, and Russ Cinder Voss would still be in that back room in the Nevada desert, alone waiting. Then I stop and I let them sit with that for a moment. Then I say I do not know if there is such a thing as fate. I have ridden too many roads and seen too many things go wrong at random to have a fully settled opinion on whether any of it is arranged by something other than physics. But I know that some patches of melted tar are placed in the road with a purpose, and I know who placed that one, and I know why he placed it where he placed it, and when he placed it. He placed it because Cinder had waited long enough. Then I point at the knucklehead in the corner, at the burgundy paint and the gold script and the name on the tank and the 50 years of Nevada desert that sits on every surface like a record of everything that passed while the bike waited for the chapter to come. Then I walk away. The prospect or the new patch or the visitor stands there looking at the bike for a while. I have watched them from across the room, not intrusively, just enough to see the moment when the weight of it settles onto them, the way it settled onto me in a room in the desert, when I was reading a letter written in 1972 by a man who had run out of road and gone to lie down and left everything he needed to say in a metal box under a floor where it waited for exactly the right patch of melted tar to put exactly the right front tire out of commission at exactly the right hour of an August morning. Some weights are meant to be shared. That is the thing I understand now that I did not understand before that Tuesday. The weight of what we owe each other, the weight of what we failed to do, and what we should have said, and what we kept when we should have given it away. That weight is not meant to be carried alone in a sealed room for 50 years. It is meant to be brought back. It is meant to be laid on the table in front of the people who need to see it. It is meant to be spoken out loud in the night, at the side of a grave, not because the speaking repairs what was broken, but because the speaking is the only honest thing left to do with it. Cinder understood that. He understood it from the beginning. He left the documentation because he understood that truth requires a container and a location, that it cannot survive as pure intention, that it must be written down and sealed in a box and placed under a floor where the right person can find it on the right Tuesday in August, 50 years hence. He was right about the bike, too. It was always a good engine. You could hear it in every detail of the machine he had left behind, in the care he had taken with it, in the way he had maintained it against the reasonable expectation of a man who no longer had any guarantee that it would ever be ridden again. He had maintained it as an act of faith, as a statement about what he believed was still possible. The bike sits in the corner of the Reno clubhouse, with all its dust intact, and will sit there for as long as the clubhouse stands. Every man who walks past it touches the seat once lightly, the way you touch something that deserves to be acknowledged every time you pass it. The touch says, "I know you were here." The touch says, "I know what it cost." The touch says, "We came, even if we came 50 years late, we came, and we brought you home, and we put your name on the wall where names that deserve to be remembered get put, and we are not going to forget again." That is the best we can do now. It is not enough. It was never going to be enough. But it is what we have, and we do it every time we walk past, and we will keep doing it until there is no one left who knows the story. And there will always be someone left who knows the story, because that is what I was made sergeant at arms to ensure. Cinder waited 19 years after Pryor was gone for someone to come down that road. He waited because he believed in the brotherhood, and he believed the brotherhood was capable of finding the truth even when it had been fed a lie. He was right. He was just off on the timing by 50 years.